I am Dr. Rapp, and this is Appreciating Shakespeare. Series 1, Chapter 7, While the Footnotes, Looking at Shakespeare's Mental Furniture. Session 1, Renaissance Words and the Renaissance Cosmos. There are three basic reasons for the need for footnotes in editions of Shakespeare's works. 1. He uses words we don't know. 2. He uses words we think we know, but in a different sense. And 3. He writes within a Renaissance worldview that is in many ways very different from ours. This does not mean that what he writes is not deeply meaningful to us, to people in all times and places, but just as we need to know what his words signify if we are to perceive those meanings, so we need to grasp the differences between his audience's worldview and our own. Let's start with words Shakespeare uses that we don't know. Because the language has changed in the 400 years since Shakespeare lived, we need footnotes to clarify words with which we are no longer familiar. Here's only one example. When we read the phrase, "hoist with his own petard," in Act 3, Scene 4, line 207 of Hamlet, we recognize the need for a footnote. That footnote would explain that hoist is a past participle of the old verb hoise, to blow up into the air, to destroy, and that petard is an older form of petard, an explosive device for breaching walls or knocking out gates, so that the phrase hoist with his own petard means blown up with his own bomb. Now let's look at words that we think we know. We also need footnotes, though we may not at first recognize that we do, to explain the words that Shakespeare used in one sense that we use in another. To us, the word still means continuing up to and through the present. Are you still studying Latin? Do you still like chocolate? But Shakespeare uses the same word to mean always. The world is still deceived with ornament, we read in The Merchant of Venice, Act 3, Scene 2, line 74, meaning the world is always deceived by outward shows. Similarly, the word suggestion most commonly means temptation. Ghostly can mean spiritual, as in ghostly father, meaning priest. Happy can mean fortunate. An addition often means a description or a list of one's characteristics or of the qualities of one's reputation. Because our modern sense of a word often seems to fit the context, we as often overlook the actual meaning that Shakespeare intends. For this reason, reading any Shakespeare play a second time with all the footnotes can yield a richer experience than just reading the play through without the notes. But much more than the specific senses of words stands between us and our appreciation of what Shakespeare means. His worldview and ours differ in many crucial respects, and grasping those differences is essential to our experiencing the deepest meanings in Shakespeare's works. I'm going to try to illustrate what I mean with a little fantasy called Shakespeare and Electricity. Imagine that Shakespeare is suddenly conveyed by a time machine to the present. Sitting in a bar, which he would call a tavern or an alehouse, he overhears two men in conversation. One says, "My supervisor blew a fuse today when his website froze." The other says, "You think that's bad? My girlfriend just pulled the plug on our relationship." What does Shakespeare think they mean? From the Latin, he would know that a supervisor is someone who looks over something, but blow a fuse? He would guess that fuse was from Latin, but he would have no idea that to blow a fuse is a metaphor for losing one's temper. If you've grown up only with circuit breakers, perhaps you will even need a footnote to define the word fuse. When his website froze might bring to Shakespeare's mind the image of winter cold freezing a spidery place, or, metaphorically, a place where the overlooker had laid a trap. In other words, he'd have it all wrong. He would feel that the phrase made no sense and want a footnote, which he would call a gloss. So far, the need for a footnote for the sake of Shakespeare's understanding is obvious. But let's now look further. Let's assume he could guess the meaning of girlfriend and relationship in "My girlfriend just pulled the plug on our relationship." But what about pulled the plug? Shakespeare didn't use the word plug, which came to English late in Shakespeare's life from the Dutch for what he would have called a bung, the wooden stopper in the opening or bung-hole of a barrel. If indeed he had heard the word, Shakespeare might at first suppose that the girlfriend had pulled out the stopper of a beer barrel to celebrate with endless drink. But then, seeing the man's unhappiness, he would imagine the man's metaphor to mean that the couple's affection was slowly draining away, like beer from a barrel, glug, 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 not instantaneously vanished, as we would think, imagining the electric plug of a lamp or TV suddenly jerked out of the wall socket. Here, Shakespeare would think he knew what the man meant. Not realizing his image was off the mark, he would not look for a footnote. Now, what would you have to do to explain to Shakespeare what these men at the bar really did mean? You might say, you have to think of lights and computers and stuff. You know, electricity. What? Says Shakespeare. The power that comes out of the wall socket to run things. Power from the wall? Are you talking about spirits? Phew! This is going to be harder than you thought, and not because Shakespeare is stupid. You realize you've got to start from the beginning. You will have to explain our ideas about lightning, describe Ben Franklin with the key on his kite, mention the inventor Thomas Alva Edison, generators, batteries, the Hoover Dam, power lines on telephone poles, and insulated copper wire. You can tell him about radio waves and smartphones in a graduate seminar later. After a few hours of explanation, Shakespeare will say one of two things. A, I think I'm beginning to get what they meant by blew a fuse and pulled the plug. Or B, you must be out of your mind. And so it is with us trying to understand Shakespeare. We share a language with him and do understand the vast majority of his words, but unless we become familiar with the ideas he took for granted, as we take electricity for granted, we will come away from reading and hearing his words with many misconceptions about what he meant. Moreover, the better we know a word, the more likely we are to be misled. Just as we need no footnotes on electricity to explain what pulled the plug means, so Shakespeare's audience needed no footnotes to know what the music of the spheres meant. But without an introduction to electricity, Shakespeare will hear web and plug and think of spiders and beer barrels. And without a similar introduction, we hear music of the spheres and think of wind chimes or some musical instrument made of metal balls. In these next 5 sessions of Chapter 7, I will try to offer brief explanations of a few of the fundamental shared ideas that Shakespeare and his audience took for granted as we take electricity for granted. Being aware of these ideas will prepare you to understand Shakespeare in his own terms. This does not mean that Shakespeare's work is any less universal. He may not have known about electricity, and we may not think of the sky as crystalline spheres, but like him we can experience the wonder of the starry heavens on a clear night, and like us, he knew all about relationships and how they sometimes end. What Shakespeare is really talking about, body and soul, nature and society, good and evil, success and failure, this world and the next, and so on, are as relevant to us as to audiences of his own time. but our access to what he is saying about those subjects depends on understanding not only the words, but also the concepts through which they are expressed. So let's look at the worldview that is the context for all Shakespeare's thinking. In his useful book called The Discarded Image, An Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature, the great literary historian and popular writer C.S. Lewis discusses the medieval vision of the world that stands behind Shakespeare's Renaissance vision. He points out how systematic were the minds of medieval thinkers, devoted to unifying all knowledge and belief in works like the Summa Theologica, the summation of theological knowledge by St. Thomas Aquinas, and like Dante's Divine Comedy, which combines into one epic poem about a man's journey to hell, purgatory, and heaven, all that was known and believed about earth, the heavens, past and future history, life and death, virtue and sin, redemption and damnation, classicism and Christianity, human psychology, science, language, and literature. Lewis sets beside these two kinds of work a third, which he calls the medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. This model was, quote, capable of giving satisfaction to the mind, vast in scale, but limited and intelligible. Its contents, however rich and various, are in harmony. Everything links up with everything else in a hierarchical ladder. By everything, Lewis means all that was known, especially from books, including Judaic, pagan, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoical, primitive Christian, and patristic books, or, by a different classification, chronicles, epic poems, sermons, visions, philosophical treatises, satires. All these traditions and works, along with all their contradictions, the medieval mind strove to interrelate, arrange, and harmonize in the great model of the universe. This medieval model of the universe was not totally and confidently abandoned till the end of the 17th century, says Lewis, and it stands behind Shakespeare as the foundation for all the unwavering universal principles that underlie his plays, and as background for all the philosophical, moral, theological, social, and political questioning, doubts, and conflicts of his time. The more we are familiar with that model of the universe that strove to synthesize all faith and knowledge, the more complete will be our appreciation of Shakespeare's works. The first thing to understand about that model of the universe, and therefore about Shakespeare's ideas of the nature of things, is that the whole universe was hierarchical. That is to say, everything was in a vertical order from highest to lowest in relation to everything else. We tend to think of all men as created equal, as the American Declaration of Independence states, meaning not identical, but having equal rights under the rule of law. We believe, often without thinking about it, that a person's rank in society should be determined by his or her individual merits, not by the rank of one's parents, or by religion, or race, or place of birth. And, thanks to Darwin, we also tend to think of all natural beings as equally competing for food and habitat. In our imaginations, the place of a plant or animal in the world depends on physical conditions and adaptations, not on a fixed, God-given plan. To some degree, we may also apply that idea to society, imagining all men to be, in the words of Hobbes, in a war of all against all. In Shakespeare's time, the picture of the world was different. For the most part, the Renaissance world, including Shakespeare and his audience, believed with some modifications in the medieval system of thought. According to those inherited ideas, Minerals, plants, animals, human beings, the planets, and the angels were all arranged by God in an order of rank that could not be broken. That vast hierarchy was sometimes called the great chain of being. Every created being had its place in the hierarchy as though it were a link in a chain extending from the throne of God down to the lowest elements of brute matter. The idea grew from concepts in Plato and Aristotle as developed by the Neoplatonists. To try to change that order was to go against the will of God and, importantly, also to go against one's own nature. Angels like Lucifer and human beings like Macbeth, who did try to step above their places in the order, suffered for it. Thus, Hobbes's war of all against all was possible, but only when free will choices were attempting to break apart that great orderly chain of the hierarchical creation. The great hierarchy of the universe was recreated within each realm, meaning kingdom, of our world as well. This idea is not totally foreign to us because we retain vestiges of that system of thought. We still use the term kingdom in our scientific classification of living things. And if I ask you, non-scientifically, who is the king of the beasts, you will not hesitate to say the lion. Many still know that the king of the birds is the eagle, king of the fish, the dolphin, because of his magnanimous treatment of men in myth and in the reports of seamen, though some said it was the whale because of his size. King of the plants, the oak tree, of the minerals, gold. This doctrine of hierarchy was not merely a doctrine of power that gave the higher the right to beat up on the lower. That a king ruled by divine right and could not, under most circumstances, be rightly overthrown did not mean that he could do whatever he wanted. He was obligated to fulfill his function in the hierarchy with justice and mercy, just those qualities with which God ruled the whole universe. And not only the king, but every person at any point in the hierarchy was responsible to those above and responsible for those below. This principle is concisely exemplified by a sentence in the Rule for Monasteries of St. Benedict, chapter 63, on the order of the community. Quote, "The juniors should honor their seniors, and the seniors love their juniors." A knight had to obey and be loyal to his lord to the king, and the king to God. But at the same time, the king was responsible for taking the best possible care of all those within his realm, making sure not only that his lords were obedient and loyal, but also that they in turn looked after their own knights and other dependents too. A good man was defined in part by loyalty and obedience to his rightful masters, trustworthiness toward his friends and equals, and just and merciful treatment of his subordinates. Since all levels of the hierarchy corresponded symbolically to all others, a prince was not only a fallible human being, but a representative of rightful authority. He was obeyed not only because he had power, but also because everyone recognized that his position was, in the state, akin to that of God in the universe. The aristocrat in his mansion, the father in his family, the lion in the jungle, the eagle in the sky, and the oak in the forest were all honored as kings, the hierarchy in each microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. The church formed a parallel hierarchy in which clerics represented the government of God over the soul and its eternal condition. Thus, a Franciscan friar was seen both as an individual person and as an authoritative voice of the Christian doctrines of free will, love, including the love of one's enemies, and humility, for which no knowledge can substitute. Those doctrines may be summed up as follows. Just as powerful herbs and swords can be turned to good or bad use, so every human being has a free will that can be turned to good or evil. And just as no herb or sword controls its own destiny, so even the human free will is partly subject to forces greater than itself. According to the very influential work of the Christian Neoplatonist called Dionysius the Areopagite, the hierarchies of angels were arranged under God in 3 orders of 9 ranks. The highest order, devoted to the contemplation of God, included seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. The intermediate order, charged with translating divine potential into created actuality, consisted of dominations, virtues, and powers. And the third order, charged with action in the created world, was made up of principalities, archangels, and angels. The last were in charge of communicating with human beings. The physical cosmos itself was also hierarchical. The hierarchies of the stars arranged in the order of the zodiac included the constellations, the stars, and the planets, including the sun and the moon. The other planets had names corresponding to the names of the Roman gods: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. Light of the sun, which is called the eye of heaven in Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, of the moon, and of the stars, was an image of the intellectual light of God. All of these stars were imagined to be fixed upon concentric crystalline spheres that revolved, turned by the will of God, in circular motion, which was thought of as perfect motion, and producing magnificent harmonies, the music of the spheres. Except in moments of special grace, that music was inaudible beneath the lowest sphere, that of the moon, which divided the perfect and unchangeable realm of the heavens from the changeable and fallen world of earth. The sphere of the moon itself partook of both natures, partly changeable, seen in the waxing and waning of the moon each month, and partly unchangeable, seen in the regularity of the moon's changes. On earth, all was subject to change, which was called mutability, from the Latin mutare, to change, from which we also get our word mutate. Each sphere was thought of as receiving God's grace from above and mediating its descent to everything below, including the realm of man, from emperors and kings to beggars and slaves, the realm of animals, from lions to beetles, the realm of plants, from the oak to the grass in the fields, and the realm of brute matter, from gold to plain dirt. As C.S. Lewis points out, when we moderns look up at the night sky, we feel we are looking out from a tiny safe place of accidental life into an infinite emptiness, dotted with distant light-generating hydrogen fusion reactions that earlier men called stars, arranged by chance and the laws of nature. And we feel that those fusion reactions could not care less about us. But from ancient times through Shakespeare's day, when people looked at the sky, they felt they were looking in, from a specially created though fallen outskirt, through a harmoniously elaborate dance of created intelligences, invisible except for their light, intentionally arranged in perfect order and beauty, toward the center, the cause and end of all being, the mind of God. If that center did not appear to the human eye as bright as they believed it to be in reality, if they could not actually hear the music of the spheres, this was only because of man's fallen nature. Man's own sinfulness was what obstructed the direct perception of the heavenly realities. Now let's turn for a moment to the mutability of the sublunary world and the idea of fortune. In this general understanding of the world as hierarchical, there was some mobility both upward and downward. However, Such movement happened not solely by man's free choice, but also governed by the will of God and the turning wheel of fortune. The ancient Roman goddess Fortuna was reimagined in the Middle Ages as having God's permission to be in charge of the distribution of worldly goods and power, which all knew to be changeable. She was pictured sitting blindfolded on a throne that rested upon the globe of the world and turning a big spinning wheel or wagon wheel. Pictured at the top of the wheel was a little king on his own throne, and at the bottom a beggar in misery. On one side of the wheel was a person climbing upward as the wheel turned, on the other side a person falling downward. So a king might fall to the position of a beggar, and a beggar might rise to the position of king, as fortune turned her wheel. But because the wheel kept turning, the new king might easily fall again to being a beggar. For this reason, in Shakespeare's plays, Fortune was often called a strumpet or a whore, because she would not be faithful to any man for long. Some medieval cathedrals depicted this wheel on their western fronts, its spokes being of stones and the spaces between them being windows of glass. The same architectural structure seen from inside the church was a great rose, symbol of the Virgin Mary, to whom the medieval cathedrals were dedicated. So though from outside the world seemed governed by the strumpet Fortune, from inside the same world was revealed to be living under God's grace as represented in the always merciful Virgin Mary. Finally, let's talk a little about the elements. If we have studied any chemistry, we may think of the physical world as being composed of about, as of today, 118 elements. Based on the ancient teaching of Empedocles, followed by Plato and Aristotle, the Middle Ages and Renaissance thought of the world as being composed of various combinations of 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And these 4, too, had their hierarchical relation. The highest was fire, whose property was to rise upward, attracted to its proper sphere, the sphere of fire imagined to be just beneath the sphere of the moon. Next came air, in a sphere surrounding our globe, then water, and then earth, whose property was to sink downward, attracted to its proper sphere, the earth. In addition, based on the teaching of Aristotle, the 4 elements were characterized by 2 pairs of opposite qualities: hot and cold, dry and moist. Fire was thought of as hot and dry, air as hot and moist, water as cold and moist, and earth as cold and dry. You will find these 4 elements referred to again and again in Shakespeare's writing. For example, King Lear, raging in the storm in Act 3, Scene 2, lines 1 through 9, calls on each element in turn: fire in sulphurous and thought-executing fires, air in blow winds, water in cataracts spout till you have drenched, and earth in the thick rotundity of the world. Having looked at the cosmic hierarchy, in the next session we will take up the hierarchy of the human order. I am Dr. Rapp, and this is Appreciating Shakespeare.